My wife raised her glass, smiled at the room, and introduced me as a nobody, and that was the moment I realized just how expensive that word was about to become. The laughter came fast, easy, practiced, the kind of laughter that lives in rooms where people believe they understand power, where tailored suits and polished shoes pass for authority, where a name on a door matters more than the hands that built the door itself, and I sat there in my chair, fingers resting lightly on the stem of a whiskey glass I hadn't touched, letting the sound roll over me like it belonged to someone else. Like it wasn't carving its way through 15 years of silence I had chosen, not endured, chosen, because that distinction matters more than people think. Emily stood at the center of it all, radiant under chandelier light that probably cost more than my first car, her emerald dress catching every flicker, every glance, every ounce of attention she had spent years learning how to command, and tonight she was in her element, confident, admired, surrounded by executives who nodded at everything she said as if agreement were currency. And maybe in that room it was, maybe that's how they measured worth, not in what you built but in who applauded when you spoke. I watched her tilt her head slightly, that subtle gesture she used when she wanted to signal she was above something without saying it outright, and then she said it, soft enough to feel casual, loud enough that everyone heard. "Oh, Daniel? He's just here with me." And there it was, not cruel on the surface, not sharp enough to draw blood immediately, but precise enough to cut deep if you understood what was being taken away in that moment: identity, relevance, presence, reduced to an accessory, a background detail in her story. And the man across from me, Jason Cole, leaned back in his chair with that confident grin of someone who had never been corrected in his life and said, "So what do you actually do, man?" And the table leaned in slightly, not aggressively, not maliciously, just curious in that detached way people get when they don't expect the answer to matter, and I could have answered, I could have told them exactly what I did, exactly who I was, exactly how many of their paychecks, bonuses, and promotions traced back to decisions made in rooms they would never be invited into, but I didn't, not yet, because timing is the difference between noise and impact, and I've never been interested in noise, so I smiled, small, controlled, the kind of smile that doesn't explain itself, and took a slow sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle in my chest while their laughter filled the gap I left open on purpose. And it grew louder, easier, emboldened by my silence, because people mistake quiet for weakness when they've never had to practice restraint. Emily didn't look at me when she laughed, not really. Her eyes stayed on Jason, on the group, on the room that validated her version of reality. And that told me everything I needed to know, not about her, but about what she thought she was standing on. Because confidence built on assumption collapses the moment assumption is removed, and I felt my phone vibrate once against my leg, subtle, deliberate, not a call, just a message, and I didn't need to check it to know what it said. I already knew. Everything is ready. That was the plan, always was, not revenge, not anger, just alignment, putting things back where they actually belonged. And I set the glass down gently, the crystal barely making a sound against the table, but it was enough. Just enough for Jason's eyes to flick toward me again, expecting something. Maybe a defense, maybe a joke, maybe an attempt to earn back a fraction of the respect they had already decided I didn't deserve, and I gave him nothing, just a steady look, calm, unhurried, the kind of look that doesn't ask for permission, and for a brief second, just a flicker, the room shifted in a way none of them could name yet, like the air had changed pressure, like something unseen had just stepped into place, and they kept laughing. Because that's what people do when they don't realize the ground under them is no longer stable. They keep laughing until it isn't funny anymore. The laughter did not stop right away, it never does, it lingers like perfume in a room built for appearances. And Jason leaned forward, elbows on the table, studying me now with a kind of amused curiosity that had not existed a minute ago, like I had shifted from background noise to a puzzle he wanted to solve. "Come on, man," he said, still smiling. "You have got to do something, right?" And there it was again, that assumption that value must be announced to exist, that if you do not say it out loud it cannot possibly be real. And I let a small breath out through my nose, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, just enough to keep the moment moving without giving it anything solid to grab onto, because the truth is, People reveal more about themselves when you give them space than when you interrupt them, and tonight I was listening, cataloging, watching the patterns unfold exactly the way I expected them to. Emily shifted beside me, her hand brushing my sleeve for half a second, not a gesture of comfort, not even acknowledgement. Just a reflex to maintain the image she had built, and I could feel the distance in it. The calculation, the quiet decision she had made long before this night that I was no longer part of the version of her life she wanted people to see, and that would have meant something to me once, years ago maybe, back when I still believed proximity guaranteed loyalty. But now it just confirmed timing, nothing more, nothing less. Across the table Richard Hayes lifted his glass, the chief executive officer. The man everyone in that room adjusted their posture around without even realizing it. And his eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, subtle, almost invisible, but I noticed, I always notice, because attention is a language most people never learn to read, and in that glance there was recognition, restrained, controlled, exactly as instructed. He looked away just as quickly, returning to his conversation with a board member about quarterly projections and expansion strategies, words that sounded impressive until you understood who had written the actual plan they were discussing. I shifted slightly in my chair, straightening my jacket, not to impress anyone, just to settle into the moment, because moments like this require stillness, not reaction. Jason kept going, emboldened now, telling a story about a recent deal he had closed, emphasizing numbers, percentages, growth, all the metrics that make people in rooms like this nod in approval, and Emily leaned in, laughing at the right places, adding small comments that positioned her closer to his narrative, closer to his orbit, and I watched the alignment happen in real time. Two people building something that looked like partnership but felt like strategy, and that was the part that mattered, not the laughter, not the introduction, but the direction they were leaning when they thought no one important was paying attention. Another vibration against my leg, a second message, confirmation layered on confirmation. The kind of precision that only exists when every piece has already been placed, and I did not check it, I did not need to. Because I had already seen this night from beginning to end long before I walked into the room. The only variable had been how far they would go, how comfortable they would get, how much they would reveal when they believed they were in control, and now I had my answer. Jason raised his glass again. To success, he said, loud enough to carry, and the table echoed it. Voices overlapping, glasses clinking, a chorus of confidence built on assumptions none of them had tested, and I lifted my glass too, just slightly, meeting the gesture without matching the energy, and for a brief second, as the crystal caught the light, I saw my reflection in it, steady, composed, exactly where I needed to be, because control is not about stopping a moment, it is about letting it unfold until it reaches the point where a single move changes everything. And we were getting close to that point now. I could feel it in the rhythm of the room, in the way conversations began to overlap, in the way attention started to scatter just enough that something unexpected could cut through it cleanly, and Emily leaned back in her chair, satisfied, comfortable, completely unaware that the foundation she was standing on had already shifted inches beneath her feet, not enough to notice yet, but enough that when it moved again, there would be no mistaking it. And I sat there, quiet, patient, letting them have their moment, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of noise is wait until the exact second silence becomes inevitable. Richard Hayes stood slowly, the kind of movement that did not need to demand attention because it already owned it, and the room adjusted without being told, conversation softened, chairs angled, eyes redirected, that subtle shift of gravity that happens when the person at the top decides to speak. And he lifted his glass just enough to catch the chandelier light, his voice smooth, practiced. The tone of someone who had spent decades being listened to. Before we move into the next phase of the evening, he began, pausing just long enough for the last pockets of conversation to dissolve. I want to say something about growth. And the word hung there, familiar, expected, safe. The kind of word people nod to without thinking because it sounds like progress even when it is just repetition, and I watched the room settle into its rhythm again, attentive now, ready to absorb whatever version of success he was about to package for them. Emily straightened slightly, her posture sharpening, eyes forward, ready to be seen, ready to be associated with whatever came next. Jason leaned back with that same confident ease, already anticipating applause, already imagining himself reflected in whatever praise was about to be distributed, and I remained exactly where I was, still, quiet, because this was the moment the script always reached its hinge. The part where expectation and reality separate if you know where to look, and Richard continued, speaking about expansion. About new markets, about the kind of strategic positioning that sounded impressive until you realized it had already been decided weeks ago in rooms far removed from this one, rooms without chandeliers, without applause, without witnesses, rooms where decisions were made without needing validation, and as he spoke, his eyes moved across the room again, deliberate, measured, acknowledging faces, reinforcing hierarchies. But when his gaze passed over me this time, it did not pass, it paused, just for a second. Long enough to register, long enough to create a crack in the narrative no one else had noticed yet, and then he said it, subtle, almost incidental. Of course, none of this would be possible without the vision that has guided this company from the beginning. And a few heads nodded automatically, assuming they knew where this was going, assuming the story had already been written. But I felt the shift, small, precise, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, it just changes direction. And Richard turned slightly, not toward the head table, not toward the executives everyone expected him to acknowledge, but toward the center of the room, toward me, and for the first time that night, the attention followed his movement instead of the other way around, like a spotlight that had been pointed in the wrong direction suddenly correcting itself, and I saw it happen in real time, confusion first, then curiosity. Then the faintest trace of uncertainty as people tried to reconcile what they thought they understood with what they were actually seeing. Emily felt it too, I could tell by the way her shoulders tightened, just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to signal something had slipped out of alignment. Jason stopped mid-sip, glass hovering for a fraction longer than necessary, his expression shifting from amusement to calculation, trying to anticipate a move he had not prepared for. And Richard held that moment just long enough to let it breathe, just long enough for the room to realize it was no longer operating on the script it had been given, and then he smiled, not broadly, not dramatically, just a controlled acknowledgement of a truth about to surface. "Some of you may not know," he said, his voice steady, carrying without force, "that the foundation of everything we are celebrating tonight was built long before most of us ever walked into this room." And the silence that followed was different now, no longer passive, no longer comfortable. It had weight, direction, expectation, and I set my glass down again, slower this time, deliberate, because timing is not just about when you speak, it is about when you allow others to realize they have been listening to the wrong story all along, and I could feel the room turning, inch by inch, attention aligning, questions forming, the laughter from earlier dissolving into something quieter, something sharper, something closer to awareness. And Emily finally looked at me, really looked this time, searching for something she could not name yet, something that did not fit the version of me she had presented, and for the first time that night, she did not look certain. The silence did not break, it tightened, pulling every stray thought back into the center of the room as if something unseen had just taken control of the air itself, and Richard let that weight settle before continuing, not rushing, not filling the space unnecessarily, because authority does not need to hurry. "Years ago," he said, his tone shifting slightly, less polished now, more grounded, "this company was not what you see today." And a few people exchanged glances, uncertain where this was going, because this was not the usual speech, not the predictable praise or safe projection of future success. This was something else, something that required attention instead of applause. And I leaned back just slightly, not disengaged, just allowing the moment to unfold the way it was meant to, because this part was not about revelation yet, it was about context. About reminding the room that everything impressive has a beginning that rarely looks impressive at all, and Richard continued, "There was no boardroom like this, no global presence, no polished image." He paused again, letting the contrast settle. "Just a small office, 2 folding tables, and a plan that most people said would never work." And I could see it flicker across a few faces, that quiet recalibration, the realization that they were hearing something they had never been told in full, because success stories are often edited, simplified, reshaped to fit the version people want to believe, not the version that actually happened. Emily shifted again beside me, slower this time, more cautious, her attention no longer on the room but on the direction of Richard's words, trying to trace where they were leading, trying to understand why the narrative felt unfamiliar, and Jason's confidence had softened at the edges, not gone, but no longer effortless, his posture adjusting in small ways that signaled calculation instead of certainty, and I watched all of it without moving, because movement would have disrupted the balance, and balance was exactly what this moment required. Richard's voice carried again, steady, deliberate. "The truth is, the foundation of this company was not built in a spotlight," he said. "It was built quietly, deliberately, by someone who understood that real control does not need recognition to exist." And there it was, the first real fracture in the room's understanding, subtle, but undeniable, because people in rooms like this are used to associating power with visibility, with presence, with titles and introductions, and the idea that something foundational could exist outside of that framework was enough to unsettle them without fully revealing why, and I could feel the attention narrowing now, focusing, aligning, as if the room itself was beginning to listen differently, not to be entertained, but to understand, and that is a much more dangerous kind of attention, because once people start to understand, they cannot go back to assuming. Richard turned his glass slowly in his hand, the light catching along its edge, a small, almost absent gesture, but timed perfectly. "There are people in this room who believe they know how this company operates," he continued, "who believe they understand where decisions come from, how direction is set, how authority is established." His eyes moved again, slower now, more intentional, passing over faces that had been confident minutes ago, lingering just enough to make them aware of themselves. "But understanding is not the same as visibility." And that line landed differently, heavier, because it did not accuse, it did not challenge directly, it simply removed certainty, and without certainty, confidence begins to erode on its own. Emily's hand tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, the smallest shift, but it was there, and when she looked at me again, it was not dismissal anymore, it was something closer to doubt, as if she were trying to reconcile the man she had just diminished with the direction this entire moment was taking, and I met her gaze calmly, not confronting, not explaining, just present, because sometimes the most effective way to change someone's perception is to give them nothing to hold on to except their own uncertainty. And Richard took a slow breath, the room now fully his, every eye on him, every assumption suspended. "Tonight," he said, "is not just about celebrating where we are." Another pause, longer this time, intentional. "It is about recognizing what has always been here, whether you saw it or not." And the words did not echo, they settled deep, final in a way that did not require volume, and I felt the moment reach its edge, that precise point where everything that comes next will redefine everything that came before, and for the first time since I walked into the room, I shifted forward slightly, just enough to signal that the next move would not be his alone. The room held its breath without realizing it was doing so, the kind of silence that does not come from politeness but from instinct, like something deeper has taken over and told everyone to pay attention whether they understand why or not. And Richard turned slightly, not fully toward me, not yet, just enough that the direction of the moment became undeniable. "There are structures in place," he said calmly, "that most people never see, systems designed not for recognition, but for control. Continuity, protection." And the words moved through the room slowly, not because they were complex, but because they forced people to rethink assumptions they had never questioned, and I could see it happening in real time, the executives who had been so comfortable minutes ago now sitting straighter, their expressions tightening just enough to signal that something was no longer adding up. Because power that operates quietly is the kind that cannot be measured by titles alone, and that realization has a way of making even confident people pause. Emily shifted again beside me, but this time there was no performance in it, no attempt to maintain an image, just a subtle repositioning, like she was trying to get a better angle on something she could not quite see clearly, and her eyes stayed on Richard now, locked in, searching for clarity that was not being given directly. Jason's smile had faded completely, replaced by a look that hovered somewhere between curiosity and concern, the kind of look people wear when they realize they might have misread a situation but are not ready to admit it yet, and I remained still. Because stillness at the right moment carries more weight than movement, and this was not the moment to interrupt, this was the moment to let realization build on its own. Richard continued, his tone steady, controlled. The ownership of this company, he said, has never been as simple as it appears on paper. And that line landed harder than anything before it, because it was specific enough to matter but vague enough to create space for interpretation, and interpretation is where uncertainty grows fastest. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the edges of the room, quickly suppressed, because no one wanted to be the first to react incorrectly, no one wanted to reveal that they did not fully understand what was being said, and that hesitation created a vacuum, a pause that stretched just long enough to become noticeable. And in that pause, Richard finally turned fully toward me, not dramatically, not abruptly, just a natural completion of a movement that had been building since he started speaking. And when he did, the room followed without question, attention shifting in one clean motion, like a spotlight finding its mark, and I could feel it settle, not heavy, not overwhelming, just precise, exactly where it needed to be. Emily's breath caught, barely audible, but I heard it, and when she looked at me now, there was no dismissal left, no casual certainty, just a question she had not formed yet, and that was the moment I had been waiting for, not the attention, not the silence, but the shift in perception, the instant when the story people believe about you begins to collapse under its own weight, and Richard's voice softened slightly, not weaker, just more focused. For years, he said, this company has operated under a structure designed to keep its true center protected, insulated from noise, from interference, from the kind of short-term thinking that can compromise long-term vision. He paused, letting the meaning settle, letting the implication take shape without forcing it. A structure that places authority where it belongs, regardless of who is seen and who is not. And that was the line that changed everything, because now it was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, it was directional, it pointed somewhere, and everyone in that room felt it, even if they could not yet articulate it. Jason shifted in his seat, a small movement, but it broke the rhythm of his earlier confidence completely, and Emily's grip tightened around her glass again, her posture no longer relaxed, no longer controlled, because control requires understanding, and understanding had just been taken away from her, and I finally moved, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the moment, straightening slightly, meeting the attention without reacting to it, because this was not about stepping into the spotlight, it was about allowing the spotlight to reveal what had always been there, and in that quiet, measured motion, the room seemed to settle even deeper into silence, as if it understood, instinctively, that whatever came next was not going to be explained, it was going to be shown. No one spoke, not because they were told not to, but because something in the room had shifted beyond conversation, and I could feel it settle into place the way a lock clicks when every pin finally aligns, and Richard took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space, the kind of space that signals a transition without announcing it, and that was my cue, not given, not forced, simply there, waiting to be taken. And I rose from my chair slowly, deliberately, not drawing attention but accepting it, because attention was already there, already fixed, already searching for something to anchor itself to, and as I stood, the room adjusted again, subtle but undeniable, chairs creaked, glasses paused mid-air, conversations that had not fully died finally disappeared, and I did not rush, I did not speak immediately, I let the silence hold for one more second, because silence, when used correctly, does more work than words ever could, and when I finally stepped forward, it was not toward the center of the room, not toward the stage, just a small shift that placed me fully within the line of sight of everyone watching, and I could see it now clearly, the confusion, the recalibration. The quiet realization that the version of me they had accepted minutes ago no longer fit the situation they were standing in. Emily's eyes followed every movement, unblinking now, searching, trying to reconcile the man she had dismissed with the presence she was seeing, and Jason sat still, unusually still, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware, because confidence built on incomplete information does not disappear instantly, it erodes, piece by piece, as reality fills in the gaps. And I placed my hand lightly on the back of my chair, grounding the moment, not for stability, but for control, because control is not about dominating a space, it is about owning your position within it, and I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough for the room to hear without effort. "It is interesting," I said calmly, my voice steady, unhurried. "How quickly a narrative can take hold when no one stops to question it." And the words did not echo, they settled, because they were not aimed at anyone specifically, but they landed on everyone, and I could feel the shift deepen the room. Leaning in without realizing it was doing so, and I continued. "You hear a name, you see a role, you assume a position." I let a small pause sit between the phrases, not dramatic, just enough to let them process. "And after a while, the assumption becomes fact, even when it was never verified." And I saw it then, that moment of internal reflection pass across a few faces, the subtle discomfort of recognizing themselves in the pattern I was describing, and Emily's posture changed again, not visibly to anyone who was not watching closely, but I was, her shoulders no longer relaxed, her expression no longer controlled, because control depends on certainty, and certainty had just been removed, and I shifted my gaze slightly, not scanning the room, just acknowledging its presence, because this was not about calling anyone out, it was about redefining the frame they were all standing in. "For years," I said, my tone unchanged, "this room, and rooms like it, have operated on visibility, on titles, on what is presented at the surface." Another pause, measured, intentional. "But visibility is not the same as authority." And that line held, heavier than the others, because it challenged the foundation of how they understood their own positions, and I let the silence stretch again, just long enough for the meaning to settle into something they could not ignore, and then I added, almost casually, "Some of the most important decisions are made by people you never see, in places you would not think to look." And I did not elaborate, I did not explain, because explanation reduces impact, and impact was already building on its own, and I could feel it now, the room no longer just listening, but recalculating, every person adjusting their understanding of where they stood in relation to what was unfolding, and I glanced briefly toward Richard, not seeking confirmation, just acknowledging alignment, and he gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but enough, and when I looked back at the room, the shift was complete. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, irrelevant. Like something that belonged to a different version of the night, and Emily's voice almost surfaced, I could see it in the way her lips parted slightly, but no words came, because she did not yet know what to say, and that hesitation, that uncertainty, was the clearest signal that the balance had changed, and I rested my hand lightly against the table, grounding the moment once more, because what comes next is never about volume. It is about precision, and the room, finally, was ready to hear something real. The silence held, but it was no longer uncertain, it was charged, focused, the kind of silence that forms right before something irreversible happens, and I let it sit there for just a fraction longer, long enough for every person in that room to feel it in their chest without knowing why, and then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, slow, deliberate, not for effect but for clarity, because every movement now carried weight whether I intended it to or not, and I placed my phone on the table, screen facing down, not dramatic, just present, a quiet signal that this was no longer a conversation built on assumptions, and when I looked up again, I did not scan the room, I did not search for reactions. I fixed my attention on one point and let the rest follow naturally, because control does not chase attention, it allows attention to come to it, and I spoke again, calm, even. "For a long time, I found it useful to remain out of view," I said, choosing each word with precision, not to impress, but to remove any space for misunderstanding. "It allows you to see things clearly, without interference, without performance." And I could feel the shift deepen, the room no longer just listening, but absorbing, recalibrating with every word, and I continued. "You learn who people are when they believe no one important is watching." A slight pause, not to emphasize, but to let it land where it needed to. You learn how decisions are made, how alliances form, how intentions reveal themselves over time. And Jason's posture changed again, almost imperceptibly, but it was there, a tightening, a stillness that did not exist before, because somewhere in what I was saying, he recognized a pattern he had been part of without realizing it was being observed, and Emily's gaze did not move from me now, not even for a second, her expression caught between disbelief and something quieter, something closer to realization, because the distance she had created earlier was no longer there, replaced by something far more uncomfortable, proximity without understanding, and I rested my hand lightly on the table, grounding the moment once more, not out of necessity, but out of control. Because grounding a moment gives it shape, gives it direction, and I let a small breath pass before continuing. Structures like the one Richard mentioned do not exist by accident, I said, my tone unchanged. They are designed carefully, intentionally, to protect the long term from the noise of the short term. And I did not look at Richard when I said it. I did not need to. The alignment was already understood, and the room felt it, that invisible thread connecting what had been said to what was being revealed. And I added, almost casually, that includes protecting the company from decisions that serve individuals instead of the whole. And that was the line that shifted the air completely, because now it was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, it carried implication, direction, consequence, and I saw it land not in one place, but across the room, small reactions, quick glances, subtle movements as people began to reassess not just me, but each other, because when the structure changes, everyone has to reconsider where they stand within it, and I let the silence return again, not heavy, not forced, just present. Because silence after a statement like that does more work than anything I could add immediately. And then, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I delivered the line that anchored everything. The reality is, I said, steady, final, the authority you have been operating under has always come from a place you were not looking. And I let that settle, did not rush to explain it, did not soften it, because truth does not need decoration, and in that moment, the room shifted completely, not physically, but perceptually, like a lens snapping into focus after being slightly off, and Emily's breath caught again, sharper this time, her composure finally slipping just enough to be visible, and Jason did not move at all now, his earlier confidence fully replaced by stillness, the kind that comes from realizing you are no longer in control of the narrative, and I straightened slightly, not stepping forward, not taking more space, just holding exactly the amount of space I had always occupied, because that was the point, nothing about me had changed. Only their understanding had, and I finished quietly, precisely. And tonight, you are finally looking in the right direction. And I let the silence take it from there, because the moment no longer needed me to carry it. No one moved, not immediately, because movement requires certainty. And certainty had been stripped from the room piece by piece, replaced by something far less comfortable, awareness, and I let that awareness settle, not rushing to fill it, not stepping beyond it, because this was the moment where everything either held or collapsed depending on what came next, and I reached for my phone again, this time turning it over, the screen lighting up softly against the polished surface of the table. And that small shift, that single action, drew more attention than anything I had said so far, because action, even quiet action, signals transition, and I tapped the screen once, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, and across the room, almost instantly, a subtle change occurred, not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable if you were paying attention. Richard's assistant stepped forward from the side of the ballroom, a tablet in hand, moving with purpose but without urgency. The kind of movement that belongs to someone executing instructions already understood, and a few heads turned toward her, confusion flickering again, trying to connect dots that had not yet been fully drawn, and I did not look at her, I did not need to, because the room would follow the motion on its own, and when she reached Richard, she handed him the tablet quietly, and he glanced down at it for less than a second before nodding once, small, controlled, and then he looked back up, not at the room, not at the executives, but at me, and in that look there was no hierarchy left, no performance, just alignment, and that was when the shift completed itself, not gradually, not subtly, but cleanly, like a line drawn across everything that had existed before this moment, and Richard turned slightly, addressing the room again, his voice unchanged but carrying a different weight now. "Effective immediately," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to register. "We will be initiating a full internal audit of executive decision pathways and authorization structures." And the sentence landed like a quiet shockwave, not explosive, not dramatic, but undeniable, because everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant, not just review, not just adjustment, but exposure, clarity, accountability, and I could see it ripple outward, expressions tightening, postures shifting, conversations that would have followed in any other setting completely absent now, replaced by stillness. Jason's hand lowered slowly from his glass, his earlier ease completely gone, replaced by calculation that no longer had a clear direction. Because you cannot calculate when the variables themselves are being redefined, and Emily's face had changed, not dramatically, not outwardly enough for anyone who was not watching closely, but I was, and the certainty that had defined her earlier presence was no longer there, replaced by something far more fragile, uncertainty. And I let the moment breathe, not adding to it, not explaining it, because explanation would have diluted what was already clear, and Richard continued. "All authority moving forward will be verified against original ownership frameworks and structural oversight." Another pause, deliberate, and any deviations will be addressed accordingly. And that was the line that settled it, because it removed ambiguity, it defined consequence without needing to specify it, and I could feel the room absorb it, not resisting, not reacting, just processing, because resistance requires confidence, and confidence had already been taken apart piece by piece, and I stepped back slightly then, not retreating, just returning to stillness, because this was no longer about me speaking. It was about the reality that had been set in motion, and I glanced briefly toward Emily, not confrontational, not searching, just acknowledging her presence in this new context, and she met my gaze for a fraction of a second before looking away, not out of defiance, but because she no longer had a clear position to stand on, and that, more than anything else, marked the shift, not the announcement, not the audit, but the loss of certainty in the one person who had been the most certain at the beginning of the night. And I rested my hand lightly against the table once more, grounding the moment as it settled into its final form, because what had been set in motion did not need to be pushed further, it would carry itself from here, and the room, finally, understood that whatever they thought they were part of when the night began was no longer the reality they were standing in now. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture into chaos, it simply went still in a way that felt heavier than any reaction could have been, because silence, when it follows truth, carries a finality that noise never can, and I let that stillness exist without interrupting it, without trying to control what it became next, because control had already been established, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity. And clarity has a way of settling into people whether they are ready for it or not, and I picked up my glass again, not to drink, just to move, to shift the moment forward without breaking it, and the faint sound of crystal against my fingers seemed louder now than it had earlier, not because the room had changed physically, but because attention had sharpened, focused, every small detail now carrying meaning, and I set the glass back down just as quietly, completing the motion without drawing it out. And when I looked up, no one was looking anywhere else, the scattered conversations from before gone completely, replaced by a unified awareness that had not existed at the start of the night, and that was the real shift, not the announcement, not the authority, but the alignment of perception, because once people see something clearly, they cannot unsee it, and I turned slightly, not toward the center, not toward the stage, just enough to disengage from the focal point I had become. Because staying in that position longer than necessary turns control into performance, and I have never been interested in performance, and as I moved, the room did not follow me the same way it had before, not because the attention was gone, but because it no longer needed to chase, it had already arrived where it needed to be, and that is the difference between commanding attention and resolving it, and I reached for my jacket, adjusting it lightly at the shoulder, a small, practical motion that grounded the moment back into something real, something human. And I glanced once more toward Richard, not seeking acknowledgement, just closing the loop, and he gave a slight nod in return, the kind that carries understanding without requiring words. And then I looked at Emily, not because I needed to, but because leaving without acknowledging her would have left something unfinished, and for a second, just a second, we held eye contact, and everything that had been said, everything that had been revealed, existed in that space between us without needing to be repeated, and she opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, as if to reach for something she could still hold on to, but no words came, because there are moments when language is no longer enough to bridge the gap between what was believed and what is real, and I did not wait for her to find them, because this was not a moment for explanations, it was a moment for understanding, and understanding does not require dialogue, and I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not forgiving, not dismissive, just acknowledging that the moment had reached its conclusion, and then I turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a natural movement toward the exit, and as I walked, the room did not stop me, did not call out, did not attempt to pull the moment back into something it had already moved beyond, because everyone there understood, whether they admitted it or not, that what had happened could not be undone by conversation, and each step felt measured. Not heavy, not rushed, just deliberate, the kind of pace that belongs to someone who is not leaving anything behind, because nothing needed to be carried out, everything that mattered had already been placed exactly where it belonged, and when I reached the edge of the room, the ambient sounds began to return, faint at first, a glass being set down, a quiet breath, the subtle beginnings of a space trying to reorganize itself after a shift it did not fully anticipate, and I paused for just a moment. Not to look back, but to let the room settle without me, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remove yourself and allow the reality you created to stand on its own. And then I stepped forward again, crossing the threshold without hesitation, and as the doors closed quietly behind me, I knew the only thing that had truly changed was not the structure, not the authority, not even the outcome. It was the way they would remember me from this moment on, not as the man who said nothing while they laughed, but as the one who never needed to say anything at all.